February 24th, 2022, 3:40 a.m. Kyiv time.
Вікова сивина твої скроні покрила, ти у рабстві була, тепер стала на крила, та імперія зла у політ не пускає. В Україні війна, вона нас об'єднає, та імперія зла у політ не пускає.
Since this morning, Russian troops have been attacking peaceful Ukrainian cities from various directions, from the northeastern region, as well as the temporarily occupied territories of Donbas and Crimea. Martial law has been imposed in Ukraine.
What happened? The war. Russian-Ukrainian war. It is no exaggeration to say Russist. Russism is a new term coined by the Ukrainian people to describe this phenomenon. Its genesis is much deeper and goes far beyond 3 decades of the independence of Ukraine and even beyond the Soviet era.
2 Рима пали, а Москва 3-й.
А 4-му не бывать.
А быть посему.
The sense of history is that all spiritual forces have been implemented and all world's contradictions have been figured out. All human intellectual reserves have been realized in order to understand that man either exhausts himself or has a continuation in various forms of existence and in various forms of statehood. LOMACHUK, writer, published.
Для того, щоб ми зрозуміли, що в основі
In order for us to understand the underlying factors of this invasion, we must look back at the cause of the formation of ideology that has become dominant in Russia today. This is the so-called theological and political concept Moscow the Third Rome, asserting Moscow as the successor to ancient Rome. The theological and political doctrine, the Third Rome, had a powerful influence on the history of the Christian civilization in Eastern Europe and at the center of Eurasia. It was formulated in the 15th-16th centuries by the hegumen Philotheos of Pskov, the main ideologist of Grand Duke Vasily III of Russia. Philotheos, or Philophei, 1465-1542, was a hegumen of the Yelizaro monastery near Pskov. He is credited with authorship of the concept of Moscow the Third Rome. Philotheos set out this thesis in his letters to Grand Duke Vasily III. The main message in this regard is rather to remind the Tsar about his ecclesiastical position of protector of faith, as the 2 previous capitals of Orthodoxy, Rome and Constantinople, both fell, first to the Latin heretics and second to the Muslim heathens, with Moscow remaining its sole bastion. Initially, the ideology Moscow the Third Rome replaced the ideology Moscow the Second Kyiv and became the semantic basis of the Messianic worldview concept of the period of the formation of the Moscow centralized state, and also appeared as a prologue to the entire philosophy of Russian history. Therefore, the prophecy of Philotheos began to gain new plots, received additional arguments and a new interpretation. That is why this ideology became systematic in the formation of philosophical and public opinion in Russia as a whole. The formal ground for the promotion of this doctrine was the second marriage of the Grand Prince of Moscow, Ivan III, to the niece of the last Byzantine Emperor Constantine XI, Sophia Palaiologina. Sophia Palaiologina 1449–1503, was a Byzantine princess, member of the imperial Palaiologos family, and Grand Princess of Moscow as the second wife of Grand Prince Ivan III. Through her eldest son, Vasily III, she was the grandmother of Ivan the Terrible, the first Tsar of all Russia. Furthermore, this concept is based on the belief that Muscovites are the only heirs of the true Christian faith. According to legend, Andrew the Apostle preached on the southern borders of modern-day Ukraine, then traveled up the Dnipro River and reached the future location of Kyiv, where he erected a cross, though according to Muscovites, he ended his journey in Novgorod. This concept was formed to counter the so-called Latins, which Philotheus called a common state of three nations: Polish, Lithuanian, and Ukrainian. But Philotheus erased all divisions and claimed that this was a single nation. Sound familiar? We have heard this concept from the definitions of the president of present-day Russia, Putin. Do you remember a conversation when he asked a little boy, "And what are the borders of Russia?" And when the boy started to list neighboring countries, Putin rudely stopped him and said, "Russia's borders are endless." Philotheus, almost 500 years ago, in 1524, justified this concept as two Romes have fallen, the third stands, and there will be no fourth. In fact, the same formula became valid and was applied from the first day of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which led to those terrible tragedies that we, Ukrainians, had to go through in Bucha, in Irpin, in Mariupol, and in all the territories that have been occupied by today's Muscovites. They march with one flag, the flag of the times of Philotheus and Ivan the Terrible. The great psychologist Jung said that there are two types of leaders in Russia: hysterics and obsessed neurotics. Ivan the Terrible was a hysteric who murdered even his own son. He was cruel with all massacres in Novgorod and Red Square, with all those enormous losses suffered by Muscovy. Ivan IV, commonly known as Ivan the Terrible, was the Grand Prince of Moscow from 1533 and the first Tsar of all Russia from 1547. He was the son of Vasily III, the Rurikid ruler of the Grand Duchy of Moscow. He entered the history of Russia with a very controversial personality. On the one hand, as a cruel tyrant with mental instability, and on the other as a reformer and publicist, the author of literary letters to various figures. He is considered a national hero in the modern Russian Federation. He ruled the longest among all Russian monarchs, 50 years and 105 days. Let's recall Peter the Great, who revived the Russian Empire with similar cruel and deceitful methods. We are going to the Latins, we will persuade them, and by cooperating with them we will expand our own boundaries and increase our own efforts in order to fight with the whole world later. Peter the Great. We know well about Peter's campaigns in the Ottoman Empire. And how did they end? Encirclement and defeat in 1711 on the Pruth River. Do we need to say anything when we see how Kirill blesses his generals to kill Ukrainians? The flag, which was once raised by the hegemon Philotheus, has never fallen. It was also raised by the White Army, as well as by Joseph Stalin, who was convinced that the Russian or Moscow imperial firman consisted in the fact that they were exceptional and they had an exceptional path. They built a new society in an exceptional way. They had exceptionally chosen this territory of the so-called Union, where they created a new person with a new ideology and a new vision, but with old mechanisms and an old ideology. Moscow is the third Rome. This is the main thesis today. The name of Ivan the Terrible is mentioned everywhere. Terrible as cannot even be contemplated without disgust. If an obsessed neurotic believes that a lie is the truth, then hysterics like Ivan IV say one thing. Why should they be convinced? They must be destroyed. Death is the best argument for our correctness. If I can destroy you, if I can blow your head off, that is my truth. This is true hysteria. Such a hysteric was Joseph Stalin. The concept of building socialism in a single country became a cornerstone of the party dogma during Stalin's rule. Entire nations were subjected to deportations. Between 1934 to 1939, Stalin and his entourage organized the Great Terror to eliminate enemies of the working class, during which more than 1 million people were imprisoned and 700,000 were executed by the secret militia. But history has its own plot. A lie never becomes a true fact. A lie has never defeated the one who is the creator of truth on earth, the Word, and the Lord's Prayer console, inspire us and give us the opportunity to believe in the formulas. Ukraine will win. Glory to Ukraine. Glory to the heroes. Yes, indeed. There are energy clots in these formulas, which are actually meant to verify the justice about a lie travels around the globe while the truth is putting on its shoes. Russians have been constantly fed lies. They are convinced that they have a special mission, a special purpose. Westerners have experienced how Russians behave in places of holiday destinations, where they, so to speak, relax. Everyone has witnessed many times how they look down upon local people of the country they are in. It is not one day in the making. It is the compounded result of centuries. It took centuries to create this type of man, who today considers himself the ruler of the whole world. He encroaches on the whole world. He induces civilization to recall the apocalypse. After all, Medvedev's threats of everything is just beginning suggest that all this happened already. Do you remember what Ivan the Terrible said when he was going to invade Kazan? A mercenary or so-called soldier of the Russian army receives 200,000 rubles, approximately $2,800, to carry out the denazification mission in the war in Ukraine, to destroy the Ukrainian nation. This was the argument of Ivan the Terrible. This was the argument of all his other followers in the Russian Empire. This is the argument of the current president of Russia, the so-called president of Russia, because he is not the president. He is an absolute impostor who was not elected, but in reality was appointed. The concepts of democracy and Russia are incompatible. This empire is doomed. It was doomed 500 years ago by the ideology of Moscow, the Third Rome, which was formed by the hegemon Philotheus of Pskov. This is what puts Moscow above all. Russia tries to surpass everyone and everything. It has the power. It possesses the largest amount of nuclear weapons. It has enough fossil fuels to be completely self-sufficient. It has enough resources to survive under any conditions. But we know well from history how the reign of Ivan the Terrible ended. We know how the reign of Peter the Great, mentioned before, ended. We know how the reign of Joseph Stalin ended. As a result, 3 famines took place in Ukraine. 10.5 million Ukrainians were exterminated in 1933 alone. This is nothing more than a purposeful denazification campaign. And all this is happening again today in Ukraine. We interpret all the events that are taking place in Ukraine today through the optics of this very phenomenon of Moscow, the Third Rome. If Moscow is the Third Rome, then why is the Third Rome the focus of all negativity, where only untruth exists, brute force, violence, and Antichrist? And this is the special mission? The host of the Kremlin revived the time-worn imperial myth that Ukrainians and Russians are one people and claimed that until the 13th century there were no differences in the languages of Russians and Ukrainians. And this is a lie. These are two completely different ethnic groups. These are two different types of culture. One and the other categories have no historical relationship. Ukraine can never be with Russia and will never be. They will never become Russians. They never were Russians. This is a completely different people, a different nation. This is a people with its own language, with its own culture, with its own heroic history, with its own special religion and attitude to God. And this difference is historical. Mark Fagan, lawyer, public and political activist from Russia. Ukraine was constantly pressured to be broken, assimilated. And this method of assimilation is used by the Russian Empire even today. They are destroying schools, hospitals, theaters. Russists exterminate Ukrainians and deport families. They did it that way back in the time of Peter the Great, when whole regiments were sent to Siberia. They sent the whole Cossack army to the so-called Persian campaign so that they all perished there. They sent us to the Finnish swamps, where a new capital called Petersburg was dug and founded. But soon they forgot Petersburg and returned the capital to Moscow. And to this day, it remains the center of all the world's tensions. This issue of the Third Rome must be resolved. And the solution is connected precisely with the armed forces of Ukraine. We believe that with our efforts, together with the efforts of the world and the so-called Latins, that's how Muscovites call all Westerners, this Third Rome will be demolished. The first category cannot be formed as Moscow is the Third Rome. There is one approach. All are equal with God, and all are equal before God. And everyone who encroached on a special priority was ridiculed by God. Today we have the opportunity to convey precisely this truth. Moscow is not the Third Rome. Moscow is a hotbed of everything related to violence. Otherwise, that rotten, smoldering corpse of the so-called leader of all nations, whom they cherish and whose name is Satan, would not lie today in the mausoleum. It was the Russian all-believers who called him Satan and his teachings Satanism. Today, we are freeing ourselves from these hell's embraces with weapons in our hands, losing the best Ukrainians. And we say to self-proclaimed brothers, you came from Muscovy, you will go back to Moscow. Glory to Ukraine!